The discussion for today is the World Council of Churches. I will be resuming the reading of the Orthodox calendar of readings tomorrow. And the readings look interesting. So I want today then to discuss the manner of tension that exists in the World Council of Churches between the Protestant denominations, which, from my intuition, seem to be primarily involved, although I have read a piece that said that the Orthodox were founding members, and I think that's true. So, as we might want to note, the Roman Catholic Church is not a member. I mean, I don't know if it's right to call them members or not, but the Roman Catholic Church, whatever the manner of affiliation, they are not formally affiliated with the World Council of Churches. So it is an undertaking of the Eastern Orthodox, so-called Eastern Orthodox. And the Protestant churches, primarily, I think, Lutheran churches, but I would be, if someone could correct me, that would be nice. And the reason I say I think it's primarily the Lutheran church is because of the two reconciliations between, what do you call them? Denominations? What do you call them? The three, I don't even want to say largest, but sort of, the churches that adhere to kind of groupings under a common title, those being the Eastern, so-called Eastern Orthodox, the Roman Catholic, and the Protestant. Those are the three. I wouldn't call them denominations. I don't think that's probably correct because of the quote-unquote proliferation of denominations in Protestantism. It seems that those three titles are of a higher genus than are the denominations of Protestantism. That is, they share more in common among themselves, those three, or they share less in common, those three, than the quote-unquote denominations of the quote-unquote Protestants. Okay. So among those three, I don't know what we call them, groups, historical groups, perhaps. I would prefer to come up with something that is, almost entirely devoid of any kind of, but semantic, but let's call them historical groups. There's two documents that I've seen that move towards something like reconciliation, that being between the Roman Catholic and the so-called Eastern Orthodox, in a document related to what has been called by some kind of the primary, if only, area of major dispute between them. That is the status of the Roman, what do they call it? Bishop in the hierarchy, in the ordering of church leadership. So let me just leave that there and come back to it. The other document that I've seen that moves towards reconciliation is between the so-called Roman Catholic. I mean, I don't know what does that mean? The Roman Catholics and the so-called Protestants on the issue of justification by faith alone. And so my reading of this is the reconciliatory document between the Protestants and the Roman Catholics contains within it a greater concession by the Roman Catholics as compared with expectation of perhaps a lay person or a kind of someone with interest in the area. And the reason for that is there seems to be, and you even see this in Bishop Barron, there is a olive branch by the Roman Catholics towards the Protestants on the issue of justification by faith alone. My reading of that document is they really do both agree that the initial act of justification is by faith alone, and that the issue of works relates to what the Protestants would call sanctification. That is a post-conversion or a post-conversion growing in Christ. Okay, so to return then to the reconciliatory document between the so-called, I'm going to stop saying so-called, but I'm just going to call them Eastern Orthodox for sake of clarity. So the reconciliatory document between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholics, as we know from, maybe this is a kind of superficial understanding of the, it was a schism in the 11th century on unleavened bread, etc. So those seem to be falling into the background. I think there's probably, you can probably get there with those. I think one thing that is a major hurdle to that reconciliation is the status of the Roman bishop, kind of with respect to his ministry. And so the easiest way to think about this is, what is the nature of authority of the Roman bishop? What does it mean to say that, and this is something the Eastern Orthodox see as well in history, is that the Roman bishop is the first among equals. And from my understanding, that has become in the East the concept of the Patriarch of Constantinople, who is the first among equals. To say that someone is first among equals perhaps can be best defined with reference to what it would mean for someone to be first among those who are not equal. So let me quickly pull up some thoughts on this. So the concept that's most relevant here is the idea of papal supremacy. So this idea of papal supremacy is the idea not only that other churches would appeal to the Bishop of Rome for guidance and assistance in resolving disputes, but the idea of papal supremacy carries with it an additional element to this advisory role, which is that the Pope is the de jure leader of the church. So de jure means in law. And so the pronouncements of the Roman bishop are not with respect to disputants, say two churches, advisory, but they are binding. Okay. Where they have yet to find common ground is in this issue. Does the See of Rome have primacy of honor, or what is known as magisterial authority? Okay, so that's where we currently find ourselves in kind of the contemporary landscape, and I'm sure there is much more nuance that I do not understand. I think just glancing at my notes here, I see that this relates to the Ravinia document of 2007. And in this document, I have written, while the fact of primacy at the universal level is accepted by both East and West, there are differences of understanding with regard to the manner in which it is to be exercised, and also with regard to its scriptural and theological foundations. I think I'm quoting someone here. It remains for the question of the role of the Bishop of Rome in the communion of all churches to be studied in greater depth. So this is the recommendation of the interdenominational, I suppose. What is the specific function of the bishop of the first see in the ecclesiology of Koinonia, and in view of what we have said on conciliary and authority in the present text? Okay. All right, so that's my understanding of the contemporary landscape of ecumenism. And so one thing I do want to draw attention to is a book that was written, I don't have the authors. Maybe I can find them, but I think I do want to say something about, because what we've discussed so far has Roman Catholicism at the center, right? It's the reconciliation between the Romans and the Protestants, and the Romans and the Orthodox. What we don't see is reconciliation between the Orthodox and the Protestants. I have yet to see a document. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but so this is a topic that I'm interested in. I've read a bit. I'm not sure how accepted this is in kind of mainstream literature, but there was, at the time of the Reformation, at least in retrospect, a fair bit of congruence between what the Reformers were doing, what the Orthodox were holding, over against the Roman Catholic Church, which you might see as an opposition to both. Okay. Again, I can try to see if I can find. I'll post if I post this after it's live, I'll do my best to find the source for this, but I want to read this. This was written by an Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox writer, and it has to do with exclusivity and inclusivity in the church. And so really the primary question posed to the Orthodox is, within the context, right? So what is the meaning of their participation in the ecumenical, right? We all want to call it an ecumenical council, the World Council of Churches. Who knows? In the conviction that, quote, the love of God surmounts, this is the Orthodox writer writing about exclusivism in the Orthodox Church. That is, you have to be Orthodox in order to be a Christian and to be saved, etc. In the conviction that, quote, the love of God surmounts the failure of love in men, unquote, that God will not turn from the prayers of honest Christians everywhere to send his Holy Spirit into their lives and the lives of their churches, Orthodox Christians are liable to make statements that stretch the sheer dogmatic limits. In this spirit, and only in this spirit, can the Orthodox call their church and the Roman Catholic Church, quote, sister churches, unquote. In this spirit, and only in this spirit, can the Orthodox speak of Christian division as a, quote, wound on the body of Christ, unquote. The Orthodox will never equate, quote, the church, capital C, unquote, with world Christianity, or see the various denominations and confessions in branches of the one tree that is the church, uppercase C. But there is a great deal from Orthodox tradition that, applied to the strange and sad situation of modern Christian division, supports the view that in God's love and in the, quote, great mystery, unquote, that is the church, Ephesians 5:32, the, quote, church operates in the schism, unquote, in anticipation of their resolution, and that the non-Orthodox, the, quote, separated brethren and sisters, end quote, can nevertheless share in the life of Christ. Okay. What does it mean to share in the life of Christ? So let me back up a paragraph because I think this will help. Dogmatically, this is the Orthodox writing. We can only say that the fullness of the capital C Church exists in the Orthodox Church. And yet, we also need to say that, quote, while we know where the church is, we cannot say for certain where it isn't, unquote. So I think if I were to interpret this as an outsider, my understanding is that my understanding of what the Orthodox is saying here, we also need to say that while we know where the church is, we cannot say for certain where it isn't. That if I were to think of a correlation, the correlation would be in the Roman Church between Christians and so-called anonymous Christians. And I think this is a helpful correlation because in a previous video that I have put up, the questions that I'm asking relate to what is the manner of distinction between one who provides a sacrament and one who receives a sacrament. And it has to do with two dissimilar techniques in the profession of clinical counseling. There are two techniques that I think exist. On the one hand, there is a technique in which the counselor may be seen as something of somebody who works on the body and alters the combination of bodily elements in such a way as to at least apparently improve health. And so we can consider someone who is a practicing counselor who does something similarly with cognitive, we might say psychic, in the sense of psychical, or those related to the psyche elements, or elements related to the psyche. That is, provide some type of manipulation wherein the apparent and relative health of the individual with whom we've performed this procedure is improved. And there's no presupposition here that the individual on whom the procedure was performed is aware of the manner in which that procedure derived its efficacy. So we might think, for example, of a surgeon who is able to improve the physical health of an individual through some surgical intervention, wherein the health of the body is apparently and demonstrably improved after the surgery, but the individual who received the surgery has no understanding of the manner in which that improvement was effectuated. We might think of this too in relation to technology. Insofar as I'm able to use this computer, I don't understand the circuitry or the machine code that goes into its why it's efficacious, but I appreciate it, and I appreciate what it does, and I can use what it does. That's one way in which to think about the Christian. The Christian is one who receives sacraments, who does not understand the means of their efficacy, but that nevertheless benefits and believes in them. That's one manner of counseling. The second is one in which the individual understands the means by which the counselor or the surgeon attempts to improve health, even perhaps going so far as to perform the procedure on themselves. So there's two ways to think about, for me, being a Christian. One, to put it starkly, is a congregant. The other is a priest. And so I want to go back to what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be an anonymous Christian, what it means to be not certain whether others are in the church or not. So we cannot say for certain where it isn't, i.e., we cannot damn anyone to hell on our authority because we do not know. And so that raises the question of what is our obligation to those who we do not know to be saved or healed or understand the practice of our art, that is, of counseling, but who nevertheless believe. And so it seems to me that the sacrament, or to put it differently, the procedure of spiritual healing, is due to those with whom we have some affiliation that we deem to be congruent with our understanding of the will of God. So and this is the minimal commitment. The maximal commitment would be with respect to an objective will of God. The minimal commitment is the subjective will of God. So we have an obligation to those whom it's sort of a Gettier problem. The Gettier problem in epistemology is the idea that it's not enough to just say something that happens to be true. You have to know why it's true. Only by saying something that's true and knowing why do we have knowledge. And so I think that has to do here with the correlation that we're thinking of, which is we cannot say for certain where the church is not, and we have an obligation to provide the sacraments to those for whom we have a subjective belief that we are so ordered by the divine will. So this raises the question, because not only can our will be over-inclusive or under, let's just say this, our subjective understanding of the will of God can be both under and over-inclusive. That is, we may provide the, I'll say, metaphorical sacrament, which is the provision of the anticipated cure of counseling. We're obligated to provide that sacrament in quotations because of its secularization. We are obligated to provide that sacrament to any individual for whom we have a subjective belief, a earnest subjective belief that our affiliation with those individuals are are ordained by God. So I think that has something to do with what we see in the Orthodox approach to the World Council of Churches. The Orthodox have a subjective belief that their actions in this affiliation are in accordance with the divine will. And so it, of course, remains as a topic of dialogue the extent to which any human individual is capable of having a non-subjective, we'll say, perception of the divine will. It seems to me, in the revelation of Christ, the existence of the Christ is the revelation of the ontological second person, the second person of the ontological Trinity in world history, that is, into divine economy. So the implication that the second person of the Trinity is revealed in history, what that tells us is that there is an existential element to the second person, because Christ is in his hypostasis of two natures. And so these two natures indicate for us that there is a manner in which the human and the divine can coexist in a hypostasis. Okay. So I'm trying to take up this discussion in relationship with the extent to which an individual can have certain subjective knowledge of the divine will, or whether or not perhaps this individual can have objective knowledge of the divine will. And it's relevant because the very idea of the ontological Trinity is a statement that is synthetically a priori. That is, it is a propositional statement of fact that is prior to experience. The very nature of the ontological Trinity is that it cannot be experienced. That's what the ontological Trinity is. It's the eternal Trinity. And so, to the extent that the eternal impinges on the finite in the hypostasis of the second person, the incarnated second person in history, we might say that there's a possibility of understanding the transcendental. The transcendental being the very conditions of our existence in Kantian terms, space, time, causality. So, is it possible to posit any foundational epistemology that makes reference to an a priori synthetic proposition? That is a statement about God prior to experience, because that is the um, that's of utmost importance in understanding the obligation of the clinician to a client with whom the clinician is unsure as to whether they have uh, the requisite manner of affiliation. That is the affiliation. So Rudolf Steiner talks about, for example, a distinction between his spiritual ontology and Christian ontology, the latter of which has to do with the entwinement of karma, the former of which attempts to avoid the entwinement of karma in the healing procedure. And so, of course, my natural reaction here is that Christ only effectuated our salvation under the auspices of so-called karmic entanglement. That is, he took up the very nature of karmic entanglement is that the sins of the one are imposed on the other. And of course, this is the very nature of the salvation, of the salvific worth of Jesus the Christ, is that he took up the sins of the others. And so we have to say, I think, within the counseling profession, of course, that the manner of the manner in which the procedure is made effective is the entanglement of karma, and the counselor, of course, is intent on you know, moving to a level in which the sins of the individual with whom they are affiliated do not affect them. But that's not to say that there is not a affiliation. So it seems that affiliation is secondary to the fears of karmic entanglement. Is how I think how I would think about this. Is this individual one for whom the karmic entanglement would be, in the final analysis, one of net positive or net negative? And so, um, within the counseling profession, that's not something that calculus is not something that would be performed. Um, a heuristic, perhaps, of it would be a heuristic of, can I actually help this client, and less about the damage to the counselor, although I think both would need to be considered. Okay. All right. Well, that's it for today.